when you look at sort of various aspects in biblical literature, particularly among the Gospels, you find that there's actually a lot of like similar stories and similar flows of stories. And it's not very hard to notice. If you just try to read through the Gospel of Matthew and then read through the Gospel of Mark and then read through the Gospel of Luke, it's hard to not notice that there's some very, very similar stories all the way through. And yet then the question is, well, how do these work and how do these compare? And what is Mark writing and what is Matthew writing and what is Luke writing? All of them pointing to Jesus, all of them pointing through common aspects that all include the Passion Week and include the resurrection at some level or experience. But the question is, well, what are they doing with all of these things? How are they building their narrative, their history, their understanding? And remember, history is always written from a point of view. So it's not surprising that from one history brought together by Mark and by Matthew and Luke, that all are accurate and yet all might be slightly different in the way that happens. And we see this among other people, and it's in the higher order projection that's important. Well, let's take a look at this in just one simple case. And by the way, I would certainly encourage anyone to sort of pick up a volume on the Gospel Parallels or any sort of thing like this. Obviously, one website that you can find today actually enumerates all of these different aspects. There's many different resources online. So one thing to look at is maybe a story that you would see of a very similar flow both in Mark and Matthew. And if you look at Mark 12 and Matthew 22, now remember there weren't necessarily chapters and verses originally written in the original documents. That's our way of handling it. But if I look at Mark 12 and Matthew 22, I have very, very similar 5 stories. The parable of the wicked tenants and the parable of the wedding banquet are somewhat different, but they have a very similar feel to the flow of what's going on in the sequence of many questions that are happening. This is happening in the temple, and Jesus interacting with a number of individuals in these conversations. So it's kind of cool that you see very similar thing, but then you start to go, okay, that's great, but how do they talk about it? And so maybe we pick up one of them, like this well-known story of what is the greatest commandment? And you see one story in Mark and one in Matthew, and interestingly enough, the Matthew story is shorter, even though Matthew is 28 chapters, Mark is 16. Now chapters aren't equal length, but you get some sense of what could be happening there. And so it's kind of interesting to see, like, okay, what's similar, what's different? And what you do notice is a few things. The core things of teacher, which commandment of the law is greatest? Well, you see pretty much a very similar phrasing there. Could be slightly different words, and we could certainly go and look at the parallels in the Greek text as well, but this is where you would begin. The same thing as you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. Again, something very similar. And clear in both of these cases is a strong statement that all of this is important. So much of the core conversation is the same. But notice there's some different things when you read carefully. Here it says, one of the scribes came near. Where in Matthew it says, when the Pharisees heard that he silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked a question. Now that lawyer and that scribe could be the same. But notice the conversation in front of it. It has a lot in terms of the connecting discussion between these pieces. And that could be very important in terms of sort of looking at an overall perspective. You can also see here, you can see obviously this one is very short here. It says teacher, which one here? It just says which commandment. That might actually be relevant in the way the story that Matthew is telling it. And as you keep going, you notice there's this whole space in the story in Mark that doesn't show up at all in Matthew. The scribes comment back and the iteration back with Jesus. And all of these are very, very important and important. And it's interesting because Mark likely was written first. So Matthew likely had Mark's gospel, or parts of it, or most of it, or some pieces of it, when he was putting this together. Why did he choose to do what he did? And what's important is to understand there's sort of key things that both are trying to get us to see. And there's truth that both are trying to see that is consistent with absolute truth. And to begin to see that is a huge opportunity. And so all of this is not a matter of how do I look at this to tear down Scripture. Oh no, not even close. The question is, how do I begin to look at all of these options to really begin to say, how do I begin to see the depth and the second layer of which Mark is telling me, and Matthew is telling me, and Luke is telling me. And there's depth and truth of each of what they can help us see of Jesus and of the early community.